From New York to our Bloomberg television and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston, and this is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We're going to start, as we usually do, by checking in on the markets with Abigail Doolittle. And Abigail, looking at your note, there's not much ambiguity today. It's a risk-off kind of day.
It is certainly a risk-off kind of day. We're looking at the worst decline for the S&P 500. Actually, we're off the lows, but at the lows, we are looking at the worst day since the end of October. That may still be the case now. At the lows, the S&P 500 down 1.6%. Right now, down 1.1%. You also have those Dow transports that we've been talking about over the last 2 weeks, perhaps as a tell on this bearish action, because, of course, that index is more economically sensitive. It, too, is down more than 1%. Crude oil joining in on the risk-off party, down 4.5%. At the lows, down 6%. And that was the worst day since early September. And the cause of all of this, David, as you know, or I believe you know, it has to do with the virus mutation in the UK. Fears that the lockdown there, that there could be some worse action here in the U.S. and that it could really crimp the global economy. Interestingly, though, bonds are rallying, but not in a huge way. Something else we've been talking about, David, as a tell on this kind of volatility is the VIX, that fear index. It has been holding 20, even as stocks were recently making all-time highs. When you put that VIX together with the Dow transports right now, the week is young, but headed toward a third down week in a row, it suggests we could continue to see some risk-off action for stocks. And it's not just fears around the virus, David. You, of course, have a strong dollar, but you also have that deal out of Washington, Congress to vote on it soon. Perhaps some sell the news there as well, David.
Well, that covered it pretty well. I must say, you mentioned the mutation over in the UK. We're waiting right now for Prime Minister Boris Johnson to have a news conference, which we will bring you when that happens. I was going to come back to the dollar, though, because the dollar had been weakening so much, but now it seems to be turning around. Is that basically just a fleeing to safety, as it were, given what's going on with the COVID?
You know, I think it has more to do with the expectation that Janet Yellen, once she becomes Treasury Secretary, that she may support a strong dollar, because I think that there had been such expectation that when she was in that position, when she is in that position, put together with Fed Chair Jerome Powell, that it's going to be a weak dollar as sky is the limit in terms of stimulus. But the signal that she may actually support that dollar, as Treasury secretaries typically do, was a bit of a signal that maybe markets were surprised by. When you have a stronger dollar, that can initially cause risk assets to sell off or certainly get volatile in the way that they have. So I think that's a little bit more of what you have happening there with that dollar, and actually off its highs. At its highs, David, up 1.4%, the best day going all the way back to March. Right now, up about 0.4%.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so very much. That was really helpful, Abigail. That's Abigail Doolittle covering the markets. Well, as I say, we are waiting right now for Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the United Kingdom to come to camera and give us a news conference, which we will take as it occurs, given what's going on in that country with COVID. But in the meantime, back here in the United States, the congressional leadership finally got its act together, finally came to an agreement. We have a stimulus bill. And to take us through it, we welcome now Greg Villiers. He is AGF Investments Chief U.S. Policy Strategist. So, Greg, it's great to have you with us as always. It's about $900 billion, as I understand it. Both sides got something, gave something.
Well, it's better than nothing, David. But I think the bottom line here is that we have avoided a recession in the first quarter. The issue then becomes, what about the second quarter?
Yeah, exactly. How long will this get us through, given what's going on with COVID more generally? Looking forward, is it realistic, given how difficult it was to get this roughly $900 billion through, is it realistic to expect we're going to come back next year and do it again?
We'll get something, I think, next year, because they left out a lot. They left out anything on state and local governments, on liability insurance, and most importantly, the unemployment benefits expire on March 14th. I think they're going to have to do a second bill. The issue is it a modest bill or is it a big bill? And that all hinges on the Georgia Senate races.
So tell us about the Georgia Senate races. I mean, the things I've seen so far has the polls, and there are not a lot of polls, let's be honest, in Georgia, that both races are just neck and neck. I mean, really well within the margin of error.
Yeah, very, very close. All the Republicans need to do is take one of the two seats, and they'll control the Senate. If that happens, we'll get a small bill late winter. If, however, the Democrats take both seats, which is not out of the question, they'll control the Senate, and we'll get a bigger bill. But I think one way or another, there was enough left out of this bill that we're going to have to get another one.
So Greg, in fairness, you cover policy, not so much politics, but the two come together on something like this. As a practical matter, does getting this stimulus, this $900 billion agreement through, does it actually weaken the case of the Democrat challengers there? Because before they could say, you Republicans kept us away from the stimulus, now the Republican incumbents can say, you know what, we delivered.
Well, I think for the next few weeks there'll be a feeling that we got something. People will get a little bit of money that'll help on their rent, things like that. But by the time we get to late winter, and the virus is still going to be very much with us in late winter, then I think there's going to be a clamor to do something more.
It's fascinating. Number one in the hit parade, though, you think is state assistance, that is to say what needs to be done, what didn't get done. Is that number one? And by the way, as I recall, Mitch McConnell say we're not going to even consider that without the liability limitations.
Well, a lot of Republicans think the state and local governments are profligate. They spend way too much money. Actually, some of the states are doing pretty well. States with high-income taxpayers have done well with the stock market this year. But an awful lot of other states, including states headed by Republicans, Texas and Ohio, have not done all that well. So I do think that the rhetoric will continue, but I think there has to be more money in people's pockets. That's the bottom line. People still have a hard time paying for rent and basic expenses.
Greg, assume for the moment that in fact the two Democrats don't both win. That is to say, the Republicans maintain at least a narrow lead in the Senate. Does the experience of getting this $900 billion package through tell President-elect Biden anything about what he needs to do going forward to work with Congress?
That's a really good question. I think the key variable here, David, is the relationship between Biden and Mitch McConnell. They're colleagues. They have known each other for decades. They understand the Senate. McConnell was the only Republican senator who went to the funeral of Biden's son, Beau. So I do think there's a relationship there, and I do think we can get more done. The tip-off, David, in the next few weeks is what happens to the cabinet nominees. If they go through pretty easily, maybe only one or two hit a snag, that'll be a good sign that we can get things done next year.
Where are we in that process as far as you know, Greg? Because I saw some early reports suggesting that, for example, Janet Yellen, the nominee for Treasury Secretary, might get confirmed as early as the day of the inauguration.
Yeah, she's going to sail through. I mean, she is so popular on Wall Street, so popular on Main Street, so popular on Capitol Hill. She'll sail through. There'll be a few others who will hit a speed bump or two. I'd be shocked if every single one of Biden's nominees got approved. So we're going to go through a lot of that in January into February, and we'll know by mid-February just what kind of an environment we have on the Hill. Is it contentious or is it conciliatory?
Okay, thank you so much, Greg. It's always a treat to have you with us. That's Greg Valliere. He's from AGF Investments. Coming up, we're going to stay on the subject of Georgia from the political side. We're going to be joined by our political contributor, Jeanne Zaino. We're just 2 weeks and 1 day away from those two runoff places, and Jeanne Zaino is going to take us all through it. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has begun his news conference over in Britain. We join it now in progress.
I want to repeat that these delays only apply to a very small percentage of food entering the UK, and as British supermarkets have said, their supply chains are strong and robust, so everyone can continue to shop normally. And to our international friends and partners, I want to say very frankly that we understand your concerns, and I hope everybody can see that as soon as we were briefed in UK government on the fast transmissibility of this new strain at, I think, 3:15 on Friday afternoon, we lodged all the necessary information with the World Health Organization, and we took prompt and decisive action the very next day to curb the spread of the new variant within the UK. And we want to work with our colleagues, with our friends around the world, as we have from the beginning, to develop new treatments and to develop new vaccines, as we have. And by the way, I can today announce that over 500,000 people, more than 500,000 people in the UK have now received their first dose. As we've seen throughout this pandemic, this virus, alas, can move all too swiftly from one nation to another, but it is steadily being defeated by an international response, and an international response that is bringing the hope of vaccines to the entire world. And in that, the UK will continue to play its full part. I now hand over to Secretary of State for Transport, Grant.
Thank you very much, PM. It's just worth knowing what's going on in Kent. Before I came here, I checked on the latest numbers. There were, last night at its height, about 500 lorries through to this morning, which were queuing effectively on the motorway. That's now down to, last time I checked, 174 lorries. And there are a few more which will be in a holding area.
Okay, we were listening there to British Prime Minister Boris Johnson holding a news conference about this new strain, as he called it, of COVID-19. He said it was just, they first learned about it at 3:15 in the afternoon, I assume London time on Friday. By Saturday, they'd taken actions to try to limit its spread. It is more virulent, he said. It is more transmissible than otherwise. He specifically addressed supply chains, which he described as vigorous and strong. He specifically said that if there were some slight delays on food delivery, they were only slight. He has talked with French President Macron about situation of reopening trade between the United Kingdom and France. As we know, France had curtailed imports from the United Kingdom. He's working with people around the world to address the issue. So he says it is a serious issue. They've jumped on it right away. They've got some issues to deal with, and they're trying to reopen trade, particularly with France. So that is a report of the news conference, and they're going to go on to other experts there. We will keep you apprised of any headlines as they develop. In the meantime, we want to get Bloomberg First Word News, and for that, we go, of course, to Mark Crumpton.
Hung up over fishing. Talks between the UK and the European Union on a trade deal missed another deadline. There are few signs that either side is ready to compromise. The two disagreements, the key disagreements, are access to British fishing waters and limits on state subsidies for businesses. President-elect Biden is adding 3 new advisors to his White House team. 2 should make party progressives happy. Mr. Biden is naming David Kamen, a former Obama administration official, as deputy director of the NEC. Bharat Mamarudi, a former aide to Elizabeth Warren, will be deputy NEC director for financial reform and consumer protection. Mr. Biden also named Joel Gamble as special assistant to the president for economic policy. Elon Musk has inquired about converting large transactions of Tesla's balance sheet into Bitcoin. On the eve of Tesla joining the S&P 500, Mr. Musk had an exchange of tweets with a prominent advocate of the digital currency, Michael Saylor. Saylor urged Musk to shift U.S. dollars from the electric car maker to Bitcoin. He said Musk would be doing shareholders a $100 billion favor. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, we just have 2 weeks and 1 day before those 2 runoff elections for the Senate in the state of Georgia. And to bring us up to speed on where we are in those 2 races, we now welcome our political contributor, Jeanne Zaino, who is professor of political science at Iona College. Jeanne, great to have you back with us. Give us a sense. I saw some polling over the weekend. There's not a lot of polling, as I understand it, but boy, it is so close, it looks like, on both races.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, the public pollsters have largely pulled out of Georgia because of the timing of this over the holidays. They don't like to call people, and also because they didn't do very well in the general election in Georgia. So they've largely pulled out. So we're just getting a trickle of public polling, and it is pretty much still within the margin of error, a dead heat, which means, of course, it's going to come down to turnout, which is, I know, annoying for people to hear, but what we always say, because that's the truth. And at this point, we already have about over 1.2, 1.3 million people who have cast their ballots already in the race. And we've had big names going down there to visit. And as you were just talking about prior to Prime Minister Boris Johnson speaking, this is all that much more important because, we have a stimulus package, it looks like now, but a big question is what happens in the new year, and do we get another package as the president-elect has been promising? And that's going to be a big question. A lot of it's going to depend on what happens in this race.
Jeanne, does the agreement on stimulus, this $900 billion, maybe a little short of that number, does that actually affect the race down there? I mean, I heard somebody this morning saying perhaps that it would make it a little more difficult for the Democratic challengers because before they got this package agreed to, they could say, boy, those Republicans are keeping you away from those stimulus dollars. They can't say that now.
Yeah, I agree with that thinking. I'm not sure that you're going to see a lot of voters change their mind because a stimulus package was agreed to. But I do think a little bit perhaps on the margin, this was a good thing for Republicans. And of course, most importantly, we heard Mitch McConnell saying that to his caucus the other day in a private phone call, saying we've got to get a deal done because if we want to hold the Senate, we've got to allow our candidates down there to be able to say, we are taking care of you in the midst of this crisis, because, of course, they control the Senate. To not have an agreement when the Democrats have come forward with a bill would have been very tough for those candidates down there. So I think all in all, this is good news for Republicans. But again, I think this comes down to turnout. So much importantly, I'm not sure you're going to see voters' minds changed a lot because a package was reached.
Jeanne, in the meantime, we have President-elect Biden naming his team, hoping it can take the field, but it's going to need some Senate confirmations. Do we have any information about the likely resistance to some of his big appointments in his cabinet?
You know, I think we always see some resistance to cabinet appointments, one or two. I think we may see one or two in this round as well. I think Republicans have already noted that. We heard some of that over the weekend on the Sunday talk shows. Again, that depends an awful lot on if they control the Senate. So that's, again, critically important. But I do think the more important question for Biden is he going to face resistance in his own Democratic Party? Because we're already hearing people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others saying they don't see the progressive candidates they wanted. And of course, the moderates are pushing back on that. So, Joe Biden is feeling it from both angles. But I do think if Republicans hold the Senate, I think we may see some pushback on a couple of these appointments. By and large, these, reflected Obama appointments, but they certainly, I think, more importantly, reflect people that Joe Biden feels comfortable with, he knows, and are moderate in the way he promised to be during the campaign. So I haven't seen any really huge surprises there in terms of his appointments.
I certainly over the weekend heard on some of the talk shows some of the more progressive voices not being shy.
Yeah, they are not shy about saying that they are not happy. We've heard a lot of talk about the fact that Biden's appointments are not measuring up to what they would like to see, particularly, again, on this issue, say, of something like the Green New Deal. That's not a big surprise because, of course, Joe Biden never promised to be that president. But I do think they're going to push back on it, and they are not going to be shy about that, to your point. And I think Bernie Sanders' comments are part and parcel of what we're going to hear going forward. And I think, unfortunately, for President-elect Biden, this is a time when he's getting probably the most support he's going to get in the Democratic Party. Right. When he has to start to deliver, it's going to get harder. And I think the fact that this stimulus bill falls far short of what Democrats wanted and what many economists say is going to make it harder.
Yeah. The bad news is this is part of the easy part. Thank you so much to Jeanne Zaino, our political contributor. Coming up, we're going to hear from the chief scientist of the World Health Organization about that new strain of coronavirus. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Bloomberg Balance of Power. I'm David Weston. Over the weekend, we learned about a new strain of the COVID-19 virus. And we talked earlier, Anne-Marie Hordern, our colleague, actually talked with the chief scientist of the WHO about this development.
It's really important that we study the impact of these mutations, particularly when it starts becoming a dominant strain. We've seen this happen before with other strains where they arise and then they slowly take over and they become the dominant strain. Perhaps they have some advantage which allows them to spread. But I think the bottom line here is really that the interventions that are needed to prevent the spread, regardless of which variant it is, are the same. And I think that's key, and that's where we should be focusing, while scientists are still doing the lab experiments to figure out what are the implications of this new variant. Does it really enhance transmissibility, as has been suggested? Does it really prevent antibodies from binding to the virus And will it have any implications for vaccine efficacy? These are still questions that scientists are hopefully going to answer in the coming days and weeks.
How long will it take, Dr. Swaminathan, until we know this variant's response to the vaccines?
I would say that it's going to take, a couple of days, if not a week or more, because there are several experiments that need to be run. And because this is, it's such an important question, it needs to be addressed properly. And we have to let the science and the data drive us. So what needs to be done is experiments in the laboratory where this strain of virus is cultured and then it's exposed to neutralizing antibodies from people who have either had natural infection or people who've received the vaccine in a clinical trial, perhaps, and who have antibodies that were, vaccine-induced. And so when we do those experiments, then we will know whether we can actually neutralize the strain of virus just like you neutralize any other strain of the virus. So we need to wait for those experiments to be done.
Is this new variant unique to the United Kingdom?
Well, the largest numbers of genome sequences of this variant have been described from the United Kingdom. There have been some reports from other countries like Denmark, the Netherlands, I believe Australia has one case. But again, we need to keep in mind that the UK is probably sequencing much more, than many countries. It's really important for us to keep track of the virus as it evolves because it's so important for treatments and for prevention, for vaccines, for monoclonal antibodies, and so on. And it's very normal for a virus to behave like this, So all viruses do. It's just that there's so much of focus and interest on this virus. I mean, the influenza virus mutates much more rapidly than the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and that's why every year we have to redo the strain selection for the flu vaccine for that particular year, and WHO coordinates that. So these are all possibilities in the future that we need to consider for this virus as well. But at the moment, I think there is no indication that either vaccines or treatments will not work. Viruses, as they come under pressure, as you start using drugs and vaccines, viruses evolve to try to avoid those. So that's the natural evolution. But at this point in time, I don't think we have any evidence to suggest that the vaccines under development, or for that matter, the monoclonals, will not work for the majority of people.
That was the chief scientist of the World Health Organization. Coming up, we're going to have Frank Luntz on the 2 runoff elections in Georgia. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. U.S. officials acknowledge there will be a lengthy effort to determine the extent of a suspected Russian hack on federal agencies and private companies. Republican Senator Mitt Romney says Russia acted with impunity, and he says President Trump has a blind spot about it. The president has contradicted U.S. intelligence officials and suggested that China may be behind the cyber attack. The Justice Department has unsealed charges against a Libyan bomb maker in the 1988 explosion of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. The attack killed 259 people in the air and 11 on the ground. The charges were announced on the 32nd anniversary of the bombing and in the final news conference of Attorney General William Barr's tenure, underscoring his personal attachment to a case that unfolded during his first stint at the Justice Department. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin says that $600 stimulus checks that form part of a COVID-19 relief bill could start going out to Americans as soon as next week. The roughly $900 billion pandemic relief plan, along with the government spending bill, is set to get votes in the House and Senate, and congressional leaders believe it will pass. The White House says President Trump will sign the measure. Well-heeled Americans are flocking to advisors to help them transfer their wealth to the next generation by year's end. They're trying to get ahead of any tax hikes or loophole closures on the rich proposed by the incoming administration. To that end, appraisers used for valuing assets have been inundated. New York firm Miller Samuels says requests for property appraisals have quadrupled as 2020 draws to a close. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thanks so much, Mark. Well, the polling that we have suggests that those two Senate runoff races down in Georgia are really both neck and neck, too close to call by a long shot. We welcome now Frank Luntz. He's welcoming back. He is, of course, a pollster and a strategist par excellence. He's the founder of Luntz Global. So, Frank, thanks for being here. First of all, what is the quality of the polling? Because I've heard there's not a whole lot of polling to begin with.
No, it's very limited, and we already know how badly pollsters did in the election in November. There's not much to suggest that they're going to get it right in January. The numbers that I have seen, including some that I've done myself, give the Republicans a very, very narrow edge within the margin of error, which is very important. We have David Perdue up by 2 points, Kelly Loeffler up by 3.5. But I want to emphasize that's within the margin of error, and turnout can change those results completely. This is going to be the most hard-fought Senate election ever in modern American history. More money has been spent. And I can now tell you that more people have voted in already early than have ever voted early in a Georgia Senate race in Georgian history.
Yeah, as I understand it, Frank, the initial indications were there are actually more people voting earlier in this runoff than they did in the November 3, which would be very surprising if that's true, because typically runoffs, as I understand it, Frank, you would know better than I, not a lot of people show up.
They don't show up. And what's happening this time is that Republicans who were told not to vote early by Donald Trump are not heeding his advice. But that's still a concern for the Republican candidates. Are people going to stay home because they're angry about the result? One half of Georgia Trump voters still believe that he won the race, and of course he did not. And the question is whether they will participate feeling that the election system is rigged. And I can't answer that now. We are in fact going to do focus groups over the next 72 hours. I'd be happy to share them with Bloomberg listeners and viewers. It has gotten ugly. All the ads out, virtually all of them are negative. And everyone's on pins and needles in Washington and in Atlanta, because this is going to determine tax policy, regulatory policy, foreign policy. Everything is at stake because of these two seats.
Well, please come back and tell us about those focus groups, provided it doesn't interfere with your holidays, Frank. So let me ask about another development. We've now got a deal on this stimulus, a little under $900 billion or so. Is that likely to play a role in these runoff races at all? I heard it suggested this morning by somebody that maybe it makes it a little bit better for the Republicans because the Democrats can't say, boy, you guys didn't get the stimulus done.
Exactly. And in fact, I think that there's maybe 0.5% or even 1% of the voters who are angry and blamed the White House for not getting a stimulus package done just before the election. We're going through that same process right now. The public they want this. They don't care how much it costs. They want money put into the economy. They want money for their own pockets. They want money for small business. This is not an environment that's normally conducive to a conservative candidate or Republican, because the public believes, quite frankly, just spend it all. They're nervous. They're having issues paying their bills. And so in that sense, it's good for the GOP. However, when we really do start to look at the deficit and the debt in the months to follow, I think there's going to be a big reckoning towards all politicians and the idea that we've gone a little bit insane, a little bit crazy in how much money we're spending.
Well, it is pretty stunning. I mean, we're saying only $900 billion. It is the second largest stimulus in history after the CARES Act, as a practical matter. But Frank, talk about the broader politics, because a lot of people, including we have Chuck Schumer just right away saying, we're going to come back and we're going to ask for more in the new year. What do you think the policy will look like in 60 days and 90 days on this if people do come back and say, we need yet another round?
It's clear this is one of the big dividing lines between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans are focused on the deficit and the debt. Democrats are focused on spending and putting money in people's pockets. Right now, the balance is on the Democratic side. The American people actually are less focused. In fact, we did a study of the 23 biggest issues in America, and the debt came in the bottom 6. That's how much it has decreased as an issue. The public is prioritizing what's happening right now. My suggestion that things are going to change, it may take months, it may take a year, but at some point, the American people know that you can't spend more money than you have. The public knows there's got to be a tax increase. The question is on who, and that's why these Senate races are so important. If the Democrats win both of these races, they will repeal Donald Trump's tax cuts. I'm pretty sure of it. If the Senate race, if the Democrats win both of these, there will be an expansion, a significant expansion in public spending. If the Republicans are able to keep even one of those races, then they keep control of the Senate, and then the policies that they've been promoting for the last couple of years will stay in place. And even on that, the public is very divided. I'm not surprised that this is so controversial. I'm not surprised that the ads are so negative, because so much is at stake and because the public realizes I'm going to be affected by it. My pocketbook, my wallet, my bank account, my savings will be determined by what happens on the 5th of January.
So, Frank, one thing that I'm puzzling about a little bit is President Trump, because it is absolutely clear he does not want to leave the stage. He wants to stay in center stage. At the same time, we've got some big things going on, whether it's the stimulus. We really didn't hear much from him on that at all. We've got the huge computer hack. Don't hear very much. Don't hear much about the vaccine, for goodness sakes, that his warp speed really helped get us there. How is he really going to maintain his position in the center of the stage when he's really spending his time talking about maybe martial law and redoing the election, things like that?
I think that history will not look well on the president being quiet, being incommunicado when it comes to the cyber breach of security. I think it will not be effective for him or positive for him when they look at this stimulus vote. I think that in the end, the American people, they themselves have moved on, and they moved on to these other crises that are affecting them in their day-to-day lives. We're losing more than 3,000 people every day. We're having more than 100,000 people diagnosed. I'm someone, look, I think you know this. I have a pre-existing condition. I suffered a stroke in January. I'm more concerned about COVID than I am about relitigating an election that is done. It's over with. Joe Biden won, and now we go on to Georgia, and then we go on to governing. Yeah.
Okay, well, you take good care of yourself. Stay safe and have a great holiday. But I do hope you come back and tell us about those focus groups. Thanks so much to Frank Luntz of Luntz Global. Coming up, what President Biden's foreign policy would look like with respect to Europe. We hear from Ambassador Nick Burns of the Kennedy School up at Harvard. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, when President-elect Biden takes office on January 2nd, he's going to have a long to-do list, led, no doubt, by COVID, but also he's got some foreign policy issues to address around the world. To go over some of those with us now, we welcome Ambassador Nick Burns of the Harvard Kennedy School. Over a distinguished diplomatic career, Ambassador Burns served as the Undersecretary of State, as well as our envoy, our ambassador to both NATO and to Greece. And we welcome him back to Bloomberg now. Great to have you with us, Mr. Ambassador. So you have really spearheaded an effort up at the Belfer Center, up at the Kennedy School, to take a look at U.S. relations, particularly with Europe. And it's entitled Stronger Together. This is part of the Transatlantic Strategy Group. I want to talk about that some, but I want to talk about it through the specific lens of the news today, particularly about that reported Russian hack of U.S. computers, government and private sector. Take us through what President Biden should do about that, because as far as we can tell right now, President Trump is, if not denying it, certainly deflecting and saying, well, it's not that big a deal.
Well, President-elect Biden, as you know, David, has already spoken out on this and said that his administration would obviously act vigorously against Russia. This may turn out, David, as you know, to be the largest cyber attack on the United States ever conducted. And as you say, against the federal government and many of our most important cabinet agencies, but also against major American corporations and major American think tanks and nonprofits. It appears to be extraordinarily widespread. And so it's just a puzzle to me why President Trump won't lead on this, why he won't criticize Vladimir Putin the way his Secretary of State Mike Pompeo did. The contradiction between the two was a really low moment in the Trump presidency, and there have been a lot of low moments over the last couple of years. Obviously, we need to raise our defenses, and obviously we need to go on the offense as well, but we've got to be able to safeguard our secret and classified information. That's true for the government. It's true for companies as well.
Nick, I want to take us back to the title of your report, Stronger Together. As you say, we need to take action, both defensive and perhaps offensive as well, retaliatory perhaps. How important is it that we be able to move together, particularly with our NATO allies?
It gives us so much more leverage when we're acting together with allies. And again, I think President-elect Biden's, his whole instinct is going to be to return to a full embrace of those allies. So on the Russia example, for instance, we're going to have a lot more weight and effectiveness if there's a combined American, German, French, NATO approach on this to the Russians. The same is true in maintaining our sanctions on the Russians for the attempted poisoning of Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, what they've done to annex Crimea, to invade and now occupy for years now, 6 years, eastern Ukraine and the Donbass. The United States is the most powerful country in the world. But with our allies, the allies are the great power differential between the United States and Russia, just as our East Asian allies are the most significant power differential between the United States and China. And President Trump got away from acting with allies. I wouldn't call him an isolationist, but I think he was definitely unilateralist in nature. He thought the United States was better off working alone. I don't think that's been proven to be true in any decade since the Second World War. Eisenhower understood, Reagan understood, and every president has understood that we're stronger if we're acting in concert. And the Russians are a real problem for us in cyberspace, but also their conventional threat to the NATO allies in Eastern Europe. And so I think you'll see under President Biden, after January 20th, a very strong focus on NATO, as it should be, and on the U.S.-EU strategic relationship, which is vital to us economically.
As you say, it's probably unfair to call President Trump an isolationist. At the same time, he seemed to be pushing away some of our NATO allies. Certainly some of those meetings that we saw seemed quite awkward as a practical matter. At the same time, it's not enough simply to embrace, hold out our arms in embracing. There are some difficult issues. For example, with defense spending, particularly with Germany, perhaps the most important member of NATO at this point besides us, real issues with defense spending, and also that Nord Stream 2. President Trump was not altogether wrong, was he?
Well, he was right. President Trump was and is right that the NATO allies need to spend more. Every president has thought so. And I think, obviously, the United States needs to continue that, spend more on defense. Nord Stream, I certainly believe Nord Stream is a bad idea for Europe. In this report, and this is a joint report between Harvard University and the German Council on Foreign Relations, so it's Americans and Europeans together, we're advocating that there be a freeze on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project. It's going to be difficult because it's about 90% completed, but we think a freeze in that project and a freeze on U.S. sanctions against Germany and some other countries in that project is the best thing to do right now. But certainly the idea that Western Europe and Eastern Europe will become increasingly dependent on Russia is not a good idea at a time when the Russians are so aggressive and in such a negative way towards the entire NATO alliance.
So, Nick, there are some tensions within Europe itself. We saw it with EU just recently, but we also see it even within NATO, and particularly on the question of democracy. NATO, I think, has always been intended to be a group of democracies.
That's right.
There are some real tensions from Hungary and increasingly from Poland. How can President Biden, when he is president, deal with those issues, those tricky issues?
You know, I don't know what President-elect Biden will do when he takes office, but our group, our combined European-American group that produced this report, Stronger Together, believes there's got to be a penalty to Viktor Orban in Hungary. He's an autocrat. He's destroyed the democracy in Hungary. To President Erdogan in Turkey, he's an autocrat as well. To the Polish government, because of their authoritarian tendencies, NATO is, at its bedrock principle, a collection of democracies. And when 3 countries among the 30 countries are going in the different direction towards populism and, frankly, authoritarianism, we think there has to be a penalty, and that would be, in NATO's case, withholding NATO's defense support funds from these 3 countries. The European Union has been struggling with this, as you know, but there's now a real prospect that the European Union might, by 2022, deny funding, some funding, to these 3 countries. They're taking lots of money from the EU. They're accepting, in effect, the protection of the United States and the larger countries in terms of NATO. And so we have, I think, a right and a responsibility to assert that there has to be a penalty for those countries that turn away from democracy. That's very controversial, obviously, but we think it's the right call.
Nick, you mentioned perhaps one of the trickiest issues, at least within NATO, as President-elect Biden takes office, and that's Turkey. And we have the S-400 Russian missiles issue. There have been some sanctions now imposed, as I understand it, by President Trump. We also have Turkey's actions in Libya, in Syria, and various other places. What is the leverage the United States, as a practical matter, has on Turkey? Do we have much leverage?
We have limited leverage. We have some. Turkey is the second largest military in NATO. It's a very important country militarily, strategically, because where it is in the world. And yet, here's a country that is a violator of human rights of its own country. There are more journalists in jail in Turkey than any other country. As you say, it's been a very negative actor in Syria as well as Libya, and it's just purchased the Russian S-400 air defense system. We can't connect that system to the NATO air defense system. It would be like letting a cancerous agent loose in the NATO bloodstream. And so I think the Trump administration was right to sanction Turkey last week. I think other countries should be doing that as well, among our European allies. You can't ignore the Turks. You've got to have a relationship with them, but it has to be honest. And when the Turks act in a way that's completely contrary to our values and interests, the U.S. and other countries have a right to fire back with sanctions and with the kind of public criticism that you've seen.
So finally, in this segment, Nick, give us your assessment of the team that President-elect Biden is putting together. I know you know Tony Blinken. You know these people. Are they up to the job?
Oh, without question. It's a strong team. First of all, President-elect Biden will be, I think, along with President George H.W. Bush, the best prepared president we've ever had on day one in the modern presidency in the last 70 or 80 years in foreign and defense policy. He's a real expert. And Tony Blinken has been, for 20 years, a major figure in American foreign policy, both on Capitol Hill, working for then Senator Biden, but also in the State Department and White House. He's eminently well qualified. Linda Thomas Greenfield, who's a friend of mine from the American Foreign Service, is going to be an outstanding ambassador to the United Nations. And Jake Sullivan, I think in every way, is a very gifted conceptualizer as well as strategist. And at the National Security Council, I think he's the right person for that job. And Avril Haines as Director of National Intelligence. This is a very strong team. It's not a team of rivals, as a lot of people have been talking about, David, but it's a team of people who have worked together, who trust each other. And frankly, we need a well-oiled team that can work together from noon on January 20th to make up for all the damage, in my judgment, that Donald Trump has done as president to American interests overseas. So I'm very optimistic about President-elect Biden and his team.
Okay, Nick, thank you so very much for being with us. And I'm delighted to say that Ambassador Burns will be staying with us for the second hour of Balance of Power on radio. We're going to talk about China, and we're going to talk about rebuilding the Department of State. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Well, the shutdown over in Great Britain is raising once again questions about in-person shopping here in the United States. But in the end, our dogs, it says Fido, but my dog is named Whiskey, actually, not Fido, needs his toys. And that leads us to our stock of the hour, which is Chewy. And to bring it to us is Abigail Doolittle.
David, it really is pretty remarkable here because we have a big stay-at-home trade on the day on fears around that UK lockdown and this new virus strain. The idea that maybe that is what it's ahead for here in New York and the United States, or of course various levels of shutdowns here in the United States, but none like that lockdown in the UK. So some fears around that, sending Chewy up 7% on the day. But this isn't new. This stock has been doing remarkably well all year long on the stay-at-home trade as folks are buying necessities for their pets, plus the luxury items for their pets from the comfort of their own home. It, of course, isn't just Chewy, though, David. It's also Wayfair and Overstock.com, all sorts of online shopping as folks have either been, really locked down, staying at home more, or even as they get back out into the world, this stay-at-home theme. And in fact, on the year, David, the stay-at-home basket up about 70% relative to the S&P 500, up about 14%, the NASDAQ 100 up about 40%. So stay-at-home this year is really the dominant theme.
Okay, so this is my question, and maybe it's better asked of an economist, Abigail, but you say that we're really up in our online sales. That sounds really, really good. But if you look at retail sales overall, those numbers we got last week were very disappointing. Are we sure we're capturing all the online sales when we talk about retail sales overall?
That may be a better question for an economist. I believe that they are captured in those retail numbers, David. But I think that, we have so much uncertainty in the macro environment right now that you could see bobbles within the economic data as, quite frankly, consumers. This has been a big year for savings for those who have the ability to save. So perhaps a little bit more cautious with the spending and coming in waves. So that, I think, is a piece of some of that weakness for the retail numbers, David, that we saw last week.
Yeah. The one thing we know for sure is that they're not spending on restaurants, they're not spending on movies, or goodness knows on travel. Thank you so much to Abigail Doodle. Thank you for that report. Our stock out on the hour, which is Chewy for all your pets at home. In the meantime, we're going to continue with Balance of Power for our second hour on Bloomberg Radio. We'll talk, among other people, to Keith Phillips of Piedmont Lithium. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.